Welcome to today's deep dive, and we're going to try to untangle a very complicated issue, the Trump administration's drastic cuts to USAID funding. The sources that we've been looking at paint a pretty stark picture of how these cuts are impacting programs all over the world.
Well, one thing that really jumps out is how these cuts represent a huge departure from how the U.S. has traditionally managed foreign aid. We're seeing a real, fundamental shift in policy, and it's happening so fast.
Yeah, and to get a sense of just how big these cuts are, imagine an organization that's providing essential healthcare to a community in Africa, a program that's really making a difference. And now imagine that program and thousands of others just like it suddenly losing all their funding. That's what many USAID projects are going through right now. Over 90% of their contracts are being targeted, which could impact billions of dollars in aid.
And the speed at which this is all happening is almost as alarming as the cuts themselves. I mean, they announced a 90-day review period, but then almost immediately funding for a lot of projects was frozen.
Yeah.
It's thrown everything into complete chaos.
Wow, that sounds incredibly disruptive.
Yeah.
Especially for projects that are actually, out there doing the work, addressing really important issues like containing outbreaks or providing life-saving treatments. Weren't some of those programs credited with containing Ebola and providing HIV/AIDS treatment? What's happening to those?
Yeah, those are exactly the types of programs that are being impacted. And this sudden halt in funding is creating a ton of problems for projects that have a really good track record of saving lives and improving global health.
It's kind of contradictory, right? Because the administration is trying to justify these cuts by saying that they're trying to eliminate waste. But wouldn't you say that halting these programs that are actually making a difference be counterproductive to that goal?
Yeah, that's a big point of disagreement. Critics argue that while there might be some cases of inefficiency, which you'd expect in any large organization, right, to just label the whole U.S. aid system as wasteful is a mischaracterization. Our sources highlight that many of these programs are really effective and they play a vital role in, furthering U.S. interests overseas.
So it's not just humanitarian aid. There's also a strategic element to it as well. Now, you mentioned that Elon Musk's team has been involved in this whole review process. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating part of this whole situation. What the sources say is that Musk, along with some members of the administration, think that a lot of USAID projects are promoting a liberal agenda. And this seems to be a major reason why they're pushing for these drastic cuts.
What does that mean in this context, a liberal agenda? Do they go into detail about that at all?
The sources don't really get into the specifics about what they consider to be a liberal agenda, but what they're implying is that certain projects just don't align with their view of how U.S. aid should be used. Maybe they're prioritizing projects that focus on democracy and human rights or environmental sustainability over others.
So there's an ideological dimension to this, where there are different opinions on what types of projects should be funded. But beyond all the ideological debates, there's some very real consequences to these funding freezes. What are some of the immediate impacts that are being felt?
Well, as you can imagine, having thousands of projects suddenly stop has created a huge amount of chaos. The sources talk about how nonprofits are scrambling to adjust. USAID staff are being put on leave or even facing termination. There's a real sense of urgency bordering on panic.
It sounds like the entire organization is in a state of upheaval. One of the sources actually included an email from a USAID official that really captures how rushed and frantic this whole thing is. They wrote, "There are many more terminations coming, so please gear up."
It definitely doesn't sound like they're taking their time and carefully considering the consequences.
No, it doesn't. And this really rushed approach is causing people to worry about whether there's enough time for, proper review and a careful consideration of what the long-term consequences of these cuts could be. It sounds like a complete mess. But it's not just happening inside USA. What kind of legal challenges and pushback are we seeing from outside?
Oh, the backlash has been pretty huge. Several nonprofits and businesses that have been affected by these cuts have filed lawsuits challenging the administration's actions. And the sources explain how these lawsuits are raising questions about whether the administration has gone too far in making these cuts so suddenly.
So it's not just about whether the cuts are a good idea. It's also about whether the administration is following the rules and acting within its legal authority.
Yeah, exactly. And the sources even talk about how the Supreme Court has had to step in to temporarily block a court order that would have forced the administration to release billions of dollars in aid. It's a really unusual situation, and it highlights just how controversial these actions are.
This whole thing is like a tangled mess of legal battles and funding freezes and ideological clashes. But let's take a step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. What are the possible long-term consequences of these cuts to USAID funding? I mean, beyond all the immediate chaos that we've been talking about.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The sources point to a bunch of possible consequences that go way beyond just USAID itself. One of the biggest concerns is how this will affect America's standing in the world and its relationships with other countries.
Can you say more about that? I mean, how could these cuts affect our relationships with other countries?
Well, U.S. foreign aid has always been a really important tool for building relationships with other countries. It helps create alliances and promote stability, and ultimately it advances U.S. interests abroad. It's about more than just giving money. It's about building goodwill and showing that America is a leader on the world stage.
So if we cut back on aid, are we risking damaging our relationships with important allies and partners?
That's a real possibility. The sources suggest that other countries might see these cuts as the U.S. retreating from its leadership role, and that could really hurt America's credibility in the world. It could also create resentment and instability in countries that have come to rely on U.S. assistance.
And wouldn't that create an opportunity for other countries, maybe ones that don't have such good intentions, to step in and try to fill the void?
Yeah, exactly. That's another concern that comes up in the sources. They say that the decline in U.S. aid could give other countries like China or Russia a chance to increase their influence and maybe even promote ideas that go against U.S. interests.
So there's a real risk that this could shift the balance of power in the world. But there are also people who say that all these concerns are overblown. They say that foreign aid is often ineffective and wasteful. Do the sources address that point of view at all?
They do, and it's important to acknowledge that there have been cases where USA and other aid programs haven't been run as efficiently as they could have.
Right.
No large organization is perfect, right? But the sources emphasize that this doesn't mean that foreign aid as a whole is a bad idea. They point out that many U.S. aid programs have a proven track record of saving lives, improving global health, and promoting economic development. To just get rid of these programs because of a few isolated cases of waste would be a mistake.
So while it's true that there's always room for improvement, and we need to make sure that aid money is being spent responsibly, the idea that all foreign aid is a waste of money is just too simplistic.
Exactly. The sources give lots of examples of USAID programs that have clearly made a positive difference in the world. They argue that cutting aid might seem like a good way to save money in the short term, but in the long run, it could actually end up costing the U.S. more, both in terms of its global reputation and its national security.
It sounds like this is a case of short-term thinking versus long-term strategic planning. We've been hearing about the possibility of diplomatic problems and geopolitical risks and the weakening of programs that actually benefit the U.S. Are there any other major concerns that the sources bring up?
Yeah, the sources also talk about how these cuts could affect specific aid programs and the people who depend on them. For example, programs that focus on things like democracy and governance, human rights, and environmental protection are likely to be hit especially hard.
And what are the implications of that?
Well, cutting back on these programs could lead to setbacks in democratic progress, increased human rights abuses, and more environmental damage in vulnerable parts of the world.
That's a pretty disturbing thought. It's easy to get lost in all the abstract talk about budgets and policy, but at the end of the day, these decisions have real consequences for real people.
I agree. The sources really drive home the point that these cuts could have a ripple effect. They could contribute to instability, poverty, and human suffering in the very places where the U.S. has been trying to make a positive difference.
It sounds like we're at a crossroads. This isn't just a minor adjustment to policy. This is a fundamental change in how the U.S. approaches foreign aid. And it could have some very serious consequences. So for our listeners, what are the main takeaways from all of this? What's the big picture here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we're seeing a major shift in how the U.S. sees its role in the world. These cuts to USAID and the way they're being made show that we're moving away from how things have been done in the past. Yeah, and while the administration is saying that this is all about efficiency and putting America first, the sources we've looked at tell a more complicated story. They raise the concern that these actions could actually hurt U.S. influence and interests in the long run.
It seems like the big question is whether this change will actually achieve what it's supposed to, or if it will just backfire. The possibility of diplomatic problems, geopolitical instability, and the weakening of programs that have a proven track record of success is pretty worrying.
It definitely raises a lot of questions, and I think for our listeners, one of the most important takeaways is that they need to learn more about this issue and get involved.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complicated it all is, but we can't just ignore it. What are some practical things that listeners can do if they want to learn more and make a difference?
Well, a good place to start is by looking for more information from reliable sources. The sources you shared mention groups like the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and Interaction. These organizations offer in-depth analysis and different perspectives on foreign aid and its impact.
All right, those are great resources. And don't forget that you can contact your elected officials and tell them what you think. Let them know that you care about this issue and how it's being handled.
Exactly. Letting your representatives know how you feel is a crucial part of the democratic process. And beyond that, just talking about these issues with your friends, family, and colleagues can help raise awareness and encourage people to think critically about what's going on.
It's all about creating a more informed and engaged public.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and watch these changes happen.
I completely agree. The more we understand about foreign aid and the potential consequences of these cuts, the better equipped we'll be to hold our leaders accountable and advocate for policies that reflect our values.
So to sum it all up, we've talked about the size and impact of these USAID cuts, the reasons behind them, the legal challenges they're facing, and the potential long-term consequences for U.S. interests in global stability. What's your final thought for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they continue to learn about this issue?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these cuts are not just about numbers and policies. They're about people. They're about the millions of people around the world whose lives are directly affected by USAID programs. As you learn more, try to connect what's happening at the policy level to the real human stories behind it. Think about the individuals who might lose access to healthcare, clean water, or education because of these decisions.
That's a powerful reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract, but in the end, this is about real people's lives. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. I hope this has given you, our listener, a deeper understanding of this complex and ever-changing situation.
It's an issue that deserves our attention and careful consideration.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with the world around you.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, the backlash has been huge. Several nonprofits and businesses that are affected by these cuts have filed lawsuits. They're challenging what the administration is doing. And the sources talk about how these lawsuits are raising some important questions about whether the administration has the authority to make these cuts so drastically and so quickly.
So it's not just about whether the cuts are a good idea or a bad idea. It's also a legal question about whether the administration is overstepping its bounds.
Exactly. And, the sources even mentioned that the Supreme Court had to get involved. The Supreme Court actually temporarily blocked a court order that would have required the administration to release billions of dollars in aid.
Wow.
It's a pretty unusual situation, and it just goes to show how controversial this whole thing is.
This whole situation is so messy. There are legal battles and funding freezes and these ideological clashes. It's hard to keep track of it all. But let's try to step back for a minute and look at the bigger picture. What are the possible long-term consequences of all of this? What happens if these cuts to USAID funding continue? I mean, beyond all the immediate chaos that we've been talking about.
Well, that's when things start to get really interesting. The sources point to a whole range of potential consequences that go way beyond USAID itself. One of the biggest concerns is how this will affect America's standing in the world and its relationships with other countries.
Okay, so how could these cuts affect our relationships with other countries?
Well, for a long time, U.S. foreign aid has been a really important way for the U.S. to build and maintain relationships with other countries. It helps strengthen alliances and promote stability, and ultimately, it helps advance U.S. interests abroad. It's not just about giving money. It's about building trust and goodwill and showing that America is a leader on the global stage.
So are you saying that if we cut back on foreign aid, other countries might see that as America withdrawing from its leadership role?
Exactly. And that could really damage America's credibility in the world. Other countries might start to question whether they can rely on the U.S. as a partner.
And that could create some instability, right? Especially in countries that have come to rely on U.S. assistance.
Yeah, that's a real concern. And it's not just about the impact on those specific countries. The sources also talk about how this could create opportunities for other countries that maybe don't have the best intentions.
Like who?
Well, countries like China or Russia, for example. They might see this as a chance to step in and fill the void left by the U.S. And that can mean promoting ideas and policies that go against U.S. interests.
So there's a real geopolitical risk here. It's not just about money, it's about power and influence.
Right. And some people argue that all these concerns are overblown. They say that foreign aid is often ineffective and a waste of money. Do the sources address that perspective at all?
Yeah, they do. And it's true that there have been cases where U.S. aid and other aid programs haven't been managed as well as they could have. No large organization is perfect, right? But the sources make it clear that this doesn't mean that we should just scrap foreign aid altogether. They point out that a lot of U.S. aid programs have a proven track record of saving lives, improving global health, and promoting economic development. And they argue that to just get rid of all these programs because of a few isolated cases of waste would be a huge mistake. It sounds like the real issue is making sure that aid money is being spent effectively and responsibly.
Right. It's about accountability and transparency. We need to make sure that aid is actually reaching the people who need it and that it's being used to achieve its intended goals.
So while there's always room for improvement, the idea that all foreign aid is just a waste of money is too simplistic.
Exactly. The sources give lots of examples of U.S. aid programs that have made a real difference in the world. And they argue that cutting aid might seem like a good way to save money in the short term, but in the long run, it could actually cost the U.S. more, both in terms of its global reputation and its national security.
So this is a case of short-term thinking versus long-term strategic planning. We've been talking about the potential for diplomatic problems, geopolitical risks, and the weakening of programs that are actually good for the U.S. Are there any other major concerns that the sources highlight?
Yeah, they also talk about how these cuts could affect specific aid programs and the people who rely on them. For example, programs that focus on things like democracy and good governance, human rights, and environmental protection are likely to be hit really hard.
And what would be the impact of that?
Well, cutting back on these programs could mean that we see less progress on things like democratic reforms, human rights protections, and environmental sustainability. It could even lead to a backsliding in some places.
So these cuts could actually make things worse in some parts of the world.
That's a real concern. And it's important to remember that all of this is happening against a backdrop of some pretty major global challenges. You know, we're facing things like climate change, rising inequality, and increasing political instability. So now, more than ever, we need smart and effective foreign aid programs.
It sounds like these cuts couldn't have come at a worse time.
It's definitely a critical moment. And the sources really emphasize that these cuts aren't just about budgets and policies, they're about people.
That's a good point. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff. But ultimately, this is about real people's lives.
Exactly. And the decisions that are made in Washington have a direct impact on people's lives all over the world. The sources make a really compelling case that these cuts could have a ripple effect. They could contribute to instability, poverty, and suffering in the very places where the U.S. has been working for years to make a positive difference.
It sounds like we're at a crossroads here. This isn't just a minor policy tweak. This is a fundamental shift in how the U.S. approaches foreign aid. And it could have some very serious consequences. So for our listeners, what are the main takeaways from all of this? What's the bottom line?
I think the bottom line is we're seeing a really big change in how the U.S. sees its role in the world. These cuts to U.S. aid and how fast they're happening, it shows a real shift from how we've done things before.
It seems like the big question is, will this really make things better, like the administration says, or will it backfire? We've been talking about all these potential problems, like diplomatic fallout and global instability and hurting programs that have a good track record. So what do you think?
There are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And I think for people listening, one of the most important things is they need to learn more about all of this and do something about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It can feel kind of overwhelming because it's complicated, but we can't just pretend it's not happening. So what can our listeners actually do if they want to get involved and make a difference?
Well, I think a good first step is to find more information from sources you can trust. You know, the sources we talked about today, they mentioned some groups like the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and Interaction. These groups have a lot of in-depth analysis and different viewpoints about foreign aid and what it does.
Right. Those are good resources. And something else people can do is contact their elected officials. Let them know what you think. Tell them you care about this issue and how it's being handled.
Exactly. Letting your representatives know how you feel is so important in a democracy. And even just talking about these issues with friends and family can help raise awareness and get people thinking critically about what's going on.
It's all about making sure people are informed and engaged. We can't just sit back and watch this happen.
I agree. The more we all understand about foreign aid and what could happen with these cuts, the better we can hold our leaders accountable and push for policies that actually reflect what we believe in.
So to wrap this up, we've talked about how big these U.S. aid cuts are and what they mean. We talked about the reasons behind them and the legal challenges. And we talked about what could happen in the long term for U.S. interests and for stability around the world. So to end this, what's your final thought for our listeners? What should they keep thinking about as they learn more about all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these cuts are not just about numbers and policies. This is about real people. It's about all the people around the world whose lives are directly affected by what USAID does. So as you learn more about this, try to think about the human side of it. Think about the people who might not have healthcare or clean water or education because of these decisions.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, but in the end, it's about real people's lives. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope our listeners have a better understanding of this really complicated and constantly changing situation.
It's definitely something we need to keep paying attention to and thinking carefully about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with the world around you.